When Eleanor Marsh pulled back her worn bonnet in Silas Crawford's doorway, revealing a scalp as smooth as riverstone and gums where teeth should have been, the rancher stepped backward in shock. "Please," she rasped, gripping his sleeve with desperate fingers, "marry me today, or we'll both be dead by dawn." Silas Crawford gripped the brass door handle with white knuckles as he stared at the woman who had just shattered his peaceful afternoon, with her horrifying appearance and even more disturbing request. Eleanor Marsh stood before him like something out of a fever dream. Her scalp completely bare and gleaming in the harsh light of the setting sun, her mouth a cavern of pink gums where teeth should have been, and yet her eyes burned with a desperate intelligence that made him pause even as every instinct screamed at him to slam the door shut. He tried to do exactly that, his arm moving to push the heavy oak barrier between himself and this apparition, but Eleanor moved faster than her frail appearance suggested, jamming her worn leather boot into the gap with surprising force. "Please, Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "I know about the Garrison property you just bought, and if you close this door on me, you'll be dead before the sun rises again." The words hit Silas like a bucket of cold water, and he found himself frozen in place, the door half closed but unable to complete the motion as his mind raced to understand how this stranger knew about his purchase when he had only signed the papers 3 days ago in the territorial office 50 miles away. The Garrison ranch had been abandoned for 3 years, or so the land agent had told him, and Silas had thought himself lucky to acquire 100 acres of good grazing land for a fraction of its value, though the agent had been oddly eager to complete the sale and had asked several times if Silas was certain he wanted that particular property. Now, staring at this damaged woman who somehow knew his business, Silas felt the first tendrils of dread creeping up his spine like cold fingers. "The Garrison ranch comes with a curse, Mr. Crawford," Eleanor continued, her grip on his sleeve tightening as she spoke, "and I'm the only one who can break it. But we need to act quickly because they always come at midnight on the full moon, and tonight the moon will be as round as a silver dollar in the sky." Silas wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, wanted to dismiss her as mad and force her from his doorstep, but something in her eyes stopped him, something that spoke of horrors witnessed and survived, something that reminded him of the way battle-scarred soldiers looked when they spoke of things they'd seen in the war. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his modest ranch yard, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, and in that light Eleanor's scarred scalp seemed to glow with an otherworldly quality that made his skin prickle with unease. Against his better judgment, Silas found himself loosening his grip on the door, allowing it to swing open just enough for Eleanor to slip inside, bringing with her the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like ashes and old fear. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closest to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Silas led Eleanor into his sparse kitchen, the room containing little more than a rough wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a cast-iron stove that had seen better days, and he poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup that he placed before her with hands that weren't quite steady. Eleanor wrapped her scarred fingers around the cup, and Silas couldn't help but notice how the skin pulled tight and shiny across her knuckles. Evidence of old burns that must have caused unimaginable pain, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of memories that no person should have to bear. "The Garrison gang," she said, taking a small sip of water, "they return every full moon at midnight to reclaim what they consider their property. But Mr. Crawford, you need to understand that these aren't living men who come riding in the darkness. They're something much worse, men who made a pact with forces that should never be bargained with, men who can't truly die, no matter how many bullets pierce their flesh or how deep the grave they're buried in." Silas felt the blood drain from his face as he sank into the chair across from her, his practical mind struggling to accept what she was telling him, even as some primitive part of his consciousness recognized the truth in her words. 3 years ago, Eleanor continued, her eyes focusing on something far beyond the kitchen walls, I lived on a small homestead at the edge of what's now your property, and Marcus Garrison, the leader of the gang, decided he wanted me for his own, but I refused him, told him I'd rather die than let him touch me. And that's when I learned that there are things worse than death in this world. Her hands trembled more violently around the cup as she spoke, and Silas found himself leaning forward despite his fear, drawn into her tale by the raw honesty in her voice. "They tied me to a fence post and set me ablaze," she whispered. "But not to kill me, no. They wanted me alive to feel every moment of agony, wanted to hear me scream until my voice gave out. And when the flames had taken my hair and left my scalp a ruined mess of scar tissue, they weren't satisfied, so they took pliers to my teeth, removing them one by one while Marcus asked if I'd changed my mind about his offer." The horror of her words filled the small kitchen like a physical presence, and Silas felt his stomach turn as he imagined the scene she described, the cruelty of men who had moved beyond human evil into something far darker. "But I survived," Eleanor said, raising her eyes to meet his. "Survived because a travelling medicine man found me half dead and nursed me back to some semblance of health, though, as you can see, there are some wounds that never truly heal, and now I've spent 3 years learning everything I can about the curse that binds the Garrison gang to this land, waiting for the day when someone would buy the property and give me the chance I've been seeking." Eleanor reached into the worn leather satchel she had carried with her and began pulling out document after document, spreading them across Silas's rough kitchen table until the scarred wood surface disappeared beneath a sea of yellowed papers and cracked leather law books that looked like they had been rescued from a dozen different sources. "These are territorial statutes and property laws dating back 30 years, she said, her damaged fingers moving across the pages with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours studying every word, and buried within them is something the Garrison gang never expected anyone to discover, a protection they cannot circumvent no matter how much supernatural power they possess." Silas leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink and legal terminology that made his head swim, but Eleanor was already flipping to specific pages she had marked with strips of cloth pointing to passages she had underlined with careful precision. "Here," she said, tapping a particular section, "the Territorial Property Protection Act of 1863 states that property owned by married women becomes inviolate against all claims of land, except those backed by legitimate debt documentation filed before the marriage date. And this provision was written specifically to protect widows and wives from claim jumpers and violent gangs that plagued the territory in those early years." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the territorial government, and continued her explanation with growing urgency. "The Garrison gang operates under old claim laws that let them seize property from unmarried owners or widows through what they call blood right," she explained. "But those same laws that give them power also bind them to certain rules they cannot break, and married women's property is completely outside their reach because the law considers it held in sacred trust." Silas felt his mind reeling as he tried to process what she was telling him. The idea that supernatural beings could be bound by human law seeming absurd even as the evidence piled up before him on his humble kitchen table. "Your deed makes you their target tonight because you're an unmarried man who owns what they consider their land," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But a wife makes the property untouchable even by the dead, because the marriage protection clause was written in such a way that it transcends normal legal boundaries and enters the realm of what the old lawmakers called covenant law." She showed him case after case where the protection had held, stories of women who had survived when everything suggested they should have perished. And slowly Silas began to understand the brilliance of what Elfnor was proposing, using the very laws that gave the Garrison gang their power to create an impenetrable defense against them. "The full moon will rise in less than 6 hours, Eleanor said, gathering the most important documents into a neat pile, "and when it reaches its zenith at midnight, Marcus Garrison and his riders will come for you, unless we act now to place you under the protection that only marriage can provide." Silas pushed back from the table and stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the rough floor as he moved to the window where he could see the sun sinking lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The weight of Eleanor's proposal pressed down on him like a physical burden as he struggled with the implications of what she was asking him to do. Marry a woman he had met mere minutes ago, a woman whose appearance made him uncomfortable despite his efforts to see past the surface damage, and all to save his own skin from supernatural forces he wasn't even certain he believed in. Behind him, Eleanor remained silent, but he could feel her eyes on his back, waiting for his answer with a patience that somehow made his internal struggle even more difficult. And when he finally turned to face her, he saw understanding in her scarred features. "I'm not asking for love, just survival," she said quietly, her voice carrying no bitterness or accusation. only a weary acceptance of reality for both of us, Mr. Crawford. Because if you die tonight, I lose my only chance to reclaim what was taken from me. And if I remain unmarried, I remain vulnerable to them forever." The honesty in her words cut through his hesitation, but still he found himself asking the question that had been nagging at him since she first explained her plan. "Why haven't you married anyone else in these 3 years? Surely there must have been someone in town willing to help you." Eleanor's laugh was hollow and devoid of any real mirth as she gestured to her ruined appearance. "Look at me, Mr. Crawford. Truly look at me, and tell me what man would willingly take me as his bride, knowing that I carry the mark of the Garrison curse, knowing that association with me brings nothing but whispers and sideways glances and businesses that suddenly have no goods to sell when I approach." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each movement of its hands bringing midnight closer. And in that rhythmic sound, Silas heard the countdown to his own potential doom, yet still he wrestled with his conscience. She continued speaking, her voice growing softer but more intense. "The people in town cross themselves when they see me coming. Mothers pull their children inside, and the preacher himself suggested I might find peace in a convent far from here where my presence wouldn't disturb good Christian folks. So you see, Mr. Crawford, you're not just my only chance tonight. You're my only chance, period." The raw pain in her admission struck Silas more forcefully than any of the supernatural threats she had described. And he found himself seeing not just the damaged exterior, but the woman beneath who had survived unimaginable cruelty and still fought for her right to exist in a world that wanted to forget she was there. The silence stretched between them, broken only by that relentless ticking clock and the distant sound of evening birds settling for the night. And Silas realized that his decision would define not just his survival, but the kind of man he chose to be when faced with impossible circumstances. Silas had barely finished nodding his agreement when Eleanor was already gathering the most essential documents into her satchel, her movements quick and efficient despite the trembling in her hands, and within minutes they were outside where Silas' horse waited, the animal sensing the urgency in its master as he helped Eleanor mount before swinging up behind her. The ride to town was a blur of pounding hooves and dust clouds as they raced against the dying light. Eleanor's thin frame pressed against him as she clutched the legal papers that might save both their lives, and Silas found himself urging the horse faster even as he worried about the animal's endurance. The streets of Cedar Falls were nearly empty when they arrived, most folks having retreated indoors for supper, and Silas guided the horse directly to Judge Morrison's house on the respectable end of town where lamplight already glowed in the windows. They dismounted in a rush, Eleanor stumbling slightly on unsteady legs before Silas steadied her, and together they hurried up the stone steps to pound on the heavy oak door with a desperation that brought the judge himself rather than his housekeeper. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s with silver whiskers and the kind of rigid bearing that came from years of dispensing frontier justice, and his expression when he saw Eleanor made it clear that he recognized her and was not pleased by her presence at his doorstep. "Whatever business you have can wait until proper court hours," he said, already beginning to close the door, but Eleanor stepped forward with surprising strength and pushed past him into the entry hall. "We need you to perform a marriage ceremony immediately," she announced, and the judge's face went from annoyed to outright hostile as he looked between Eleanor and Silas with obvious disgust. "I will do no such thing," Morrison declared, "especially not for the woman this town knows to be cursed, and Mr. Crawford, if you had any sense you'd distance yourself from this creature before her misfortune becomes yours." Eleanor reached into her satchel and pulled out a different set of documents than she had shown Silas, spreading them on the judge's polished entry table with grim determination. "These are death certificates, Judge Morrison," she said, her voice steady as steel. 17 men and women who owned property the Garrison gang wanted, all dead under mysterious circumstances, all on the night of a full moon, and all unmarried or widowed at the time of their deaths. The judge's face paled as he recognized several of the names, people he had known personally, and Eleanor pressed her advantage. "You signed 5 of these death certificates yourself. Marked them as accidents or natural causes because it was easier than admitting something supernatural was hunting people in your jurisdiction, but we both know the truth, don't we, Judge?" The lamplight flickered as darkness pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance a church bell began to toll the hour, each chime a reminder of how little time remained. "Sign the marriage certificate, Judge, unless you want 2 more bodies on your conscience by morning," Eleanor said, and the judge's hand trembled as he reached for his pen. the marriage certificate tucked safely in Eleanor's satchel, along with the other precious documents. Silas and Eleanor raced through the darkened streets of Cedar Falls back to where they had left the horse, the animal pawing nervously at the ground as if it too could sense the approaching danger. Silas helped Eleanor mount first before swinging up behind her, and they set off at a gallop toward the ranch, the full moon beginning to rise over the eastern hills like a great silver eye opening to witness whatever fate awaited them. They had covered perhaps half the distance when disaster struck in the form of a metallic ping, followed by the horse's sudden stumble, and Silas knew immediately that they had thrown a shoe, the animal limping to a stop despite his urgent commands. There was no time to tend to the injury properly, and after a moment's desperate consideration, Silas dismounted and helped Eleanor down, knowing they would have to cover the remaining miles on foot through the darkness. The prairie trail stretched before them, bathed in the eerie light of the rising moon that turned familiar landmarks into twisted shadows, and as they hurried forward, Silas became aware of an unnatural cold settling over the landscape despite the warm autumn night. Eleanor struggled to match his pace, her breathing becoming laboured as they half ran, half stumbled along the rutted path. And that was when they first heard it, the sound of hoof-beats that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing across the grassland in a rhythm that matched no earthly horse. The sound grew closer, then faded, then approached from a different direction entirely, as if the riders were circling them like wolves testing their prey. And Silas felt Eleanor's hand tighten on his arm as she recognised what he was only beginning to understand. "They're coming," she gasped between ragged breaths. "They know about the marriage and they're trying to reach us before we can get to the safety of your threshold, because once we cross it as husband and wife, their power over the property ends forever." The supernatural hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like laughter carried on the wind, cruel and hollow and entirely inhuman, and Silas found himself pulling Eleanor faster despite his own burning lungs. She stumbled over a hidden root, crying out as she fell hard onto the packed earth, and when she tried to rise, it was clear that she had twisted her ankle badly in the fall. Without hesitation, Silas bent and lifted her into his arms, her weight surprisingly light despite his exhaustion, and he began to run in earnest now, his boots pounding against the trail as the ghostly riders seemed to close in from all sides. The ranch house finally came into view in the distance, its windows dark but solid and real against the nightmare landscape, and Silas pushed himself harder more, his muscles screaming in protest as he carried his new bride toward the only sanctuary that might save them both from the supernatural vengeance racing through the night toward them. Silas had barely managed to stumble onto his ranch house porch with Eleanor still in his arms when the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath began to fog in the air, and the natural sounds of the night ceased entirely, as if every living creature had fled from what was approaching. He set Eleanor down gently, supporting her as she tested her injured ankle, and together they turned to face the open ground before the house where shadows were beginning to coalesce into shapes that should not exist in any rational world. From the darkness they emerged, 5 riders on horses that seemed to be made of shadow and moonlight rather than flesh and bone, their hooves making that terrible echoing sound that had pursued them across the prairie, and at their head rode a figure that could only be Marcus Garrison. The man was exactly as Eleanor had described him in her tale of torture, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel twist of his mouth and the unnatural glow that emanated from his eyes, like hot coals in the darkness. The other 4 riders spread out in a semicircle, trapping Silas and Eleanor against the porch railing, their movements perfectly coordinated like wolves that had hunted together for so long they no longer needed to communicate their intentions. Marcus Garrison leaned forward in his saddle, and when he spoke, his voice carried the chill of the grave and the weight of supernatural authority that made Silas's knees weak with primal fear. "Well now," Garrison said, his glowing eyes fixed on Silas, "seems we have ourselves a new owner who needs to learn how things work in these parts, and the price for that education is going to be steep unless you're smart enough to surrender the property before the blood price is paid." The threat hung in the air like ice crystals, and Silas felt Eleanor straighten beside him, her injured ankle forgotten as she stepped forward with a courage that seemed to transform her damaged appearance into something almost regal. "He can't surrender what's mine by marriage law," she declared, her voice ringing clear and strong across the yard. "And I see you remember me, Marcus. Remember what you did to me 3 years ago when I refused to give you what you wanted, but tonight your cruelty comes back to haunt you in ways you never expected." The ghostly riders shifted uneasily at her words, their spectral horses pawing at ground that seemed to smoke beneath their hooves, and Marcus Garrison's expression darkened with a fury that made his eyes burn even brighter. "You think a piece of paper signed by that coward Morrison will protect you from what we are, from the claim we've held on this land since before you were born, little Eleanor?" But even as he spoke, Silas noticed that the riders had stopped their advance, holding their position at the edge of the property as if an invisible barrier prevented them from coming closer, and he began to understand that Eleanor's desperate plan might actually be working. The massive grandfather clock that Silas had inherited with the house began to chime from inside, its deep bronze tones carrying across the yard with supernatural clarity, and with each strike Eleanor seemed to grow taller and more confident, her damaged appearance no longer diminishing her presence, but somehow enhancing it. One chime, 2, 3, and the ghostly riders grew more agitated, their spectral horses dancing and snorting clouds of frost into the night air as Marcus Garrison's glowing eyes fixed on Eleanor with growing recognition and something that might have been fear. As the clock continued its relentless count toward midnight, Eleanor stepped forward again, pulling from her satchel one final document that she held high for all to see, and her voice when she spoke carried the weight of years of planning and pain. "You want to know why the fire didn't kill me, Marcus, and why your torture couldn't break me, why I've spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment." The clock struck 9, 10 in, and the wind began to rise around them, swirling with unnatural force that pulled at clothing and hair but somehow left Eleanor untouched, at the centre of the growing storm. "Because you can't kill what shares your own cursed blood," she declared. And as the 11th chime rang out, she spoke the words that changed everything. "I am Eleanor Garrison, your daughter by Sarah Marsh, the woman you abandoned when she wouldn't join your pack with darkness, the child you tried to erase from existence when you learned I had a stronger claim to this land than you ever would." The final chimes struck midnight with a resonance that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, and Marcus Garrison's face contorted with rage and recognition as the truth finally assembled itself in all its terrible clarity. "You burned me not for refusing you, but for existing, for being living proof that this land passed to me through my mother's line before you ever made your dark pact. And all your supernatural power cannot change the fact that both blood and law name me the rightful heir to every acre you've tried to claim." The document in her hand burst into supernatural flame that didn't consume it, but instead illuminated the legal seal and the names written there, including her birth record that Marcus had thought destroyed years ago. Silas watched in stunned amazement as the pieces fell into place, understanding now why Eleanor had been so certain her plan would work, why she knew so much about the curse, why she had waited specifically for someone to buy the land and provide her with the legal protection of marriage. The wind howled around them like a living thing, as Eleanor stood firm against her father's supernatural fury, her voice rising above the storm to deliver the final blow to his claims. "You can't take what blood and law have given me, Marcus Garrison, because this land was mine from birth, and now through marriage it's protected by laws older than your curse. Laws you yourself helped write into the territorial codes when you thought they would protect your own interests, never imagining that your abandoned daughter would one day use them against you." The supernatural wind that had been howling around them suddenly stilled as if the very air itself was holding its breath, and Silas watched in amazement as the ghostly riders began to flicker like candle flames in a draught, their solid forms becoming translucent as Eleanor stood firm with the burning document held high above her head. Marcus Garrison's expression shifted from rage to something like resignation as he felt his ethereal form beginning to unravel at the edges, the dark pact that had sustained him and his gang for years crumbling beneath the combined weight of blood right and marriage law that created an unbreakable shield around the property. "You found the one solution we couldn't counter," Marcus said, his voice already beginning to fade like an echo in a vast canyon. "The marriage protection alone we could have eventually broken, and the blood claim alone we might have contested, but together they form a barrier that even our darkness cannot penetrate." The other 4 riders were dissolving more quickly, their forms breaking apart like smoke in a strong wind, and their horses simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, leaving the men standing on the ground that could no longer support their supernatural presence. One by one they faded completely, their faces showing relief rather than anger, as if the dissolution was a release from a prison they had created for themselves. And soon only Marcus remained, his form wavering but still holding together through sheer force of will. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and as the light grew stronger, Marcus grew weaker. his glowing eyes dimming to something almost human in these final moments. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that might have been pride mixed with regret, then turned his fading gaze to Silas, who still stood protectively beside his new bride despite everything he had witnessed. "Take care of her, rancher," Marcus said, his voice now barely a whisper on the morning breeze. "She's stronger than she looks, stronger than I ever gave her credit for, and she'll make this land prosper in ways I never could with all my dark power." As he spoke these final words, the curse that had held him to this plane of existence finally shattered completely, and Marcus Garrison dispersed into the morning air like mist burning off under the rising sun, leaving nothing behind but the memory of his presence and the faint smell of sulphur that quickly dissipated. The transformation was immediate and profound as the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the property lifted like a heavy blanket being pulled away, and Silas could hear the return of natural sounds as birds began their morning songs and insects resumed their constant chorus. Eleanor lowered her arms, the document in her hands no longer burning with supernatural fire, but simply an old piece of paper that contained the truth of her identity, and she turned to Silas with tears streaming down her scarred cheeks, tears of relief and triumph and the release of 3 years of careful planning finally coming to fruition. The spring sun cast long golden rays across the Garrison ranch as Silas Crawford stood on the porch watching his wife Eleanor work with their newest ranch hand to repair the eastern fence line, her movements confident and sure as she directed the work with an expertise that still amazed him after 6 months of marriage. The transformation in both the land and the woman had been remarkable to witness, beginning with small changes that accumulated into something profound and lasting, like the way Eleanor's scalp now showed patches of silver hair growing in soft wisps that caught the light when she moved, or how her hollow cheeks had filled out with proper meals and freedom from constant fear. The ranch itself had flourished under their joint management, with Eleanor's intimate knowledge of every acre combining with Silas's capacity for hard work to create an operation that was already turning profits beyond what either had dared hope for Buto or in those first desperate days. Their cattle grew fat on pastures that Eleanor knew how to irrigate properly, using systems her mother had designed years before Marcus Garrison had brought his darkness to the land, and the vegetable gardens she had planted yielded crops that fed not only them, but provided surplus to trade in town. Speaking of town, the transformation in how the citizens of Cedar Falls treated Eleanor had been perhaps the most dramatic change of all, beginning with tentative greetings from merchants who had previously crossed the street to avoid her, then progressing to actual invitations to social gatherings as word spread about the breaking of the Garrison curse. Mrs. Morrison, the judge's wife, had even called last week to invite Eleanor to join the church auxiliary, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when everyone believed Eleanor carried misfortune like a disease. The success of their ranch had spoken louder than any reassurances could have, proving that the curse was truly broken and that association with Eleanor brought prosperity rather than doom, though Silas suspected that her gentle nature and quick mind had done as much to change hearts as their material success. As Eleanor finished with the fence and walked back toward the house, Silas noticed how she no longer hunched her shoulders or kept her head down, but walked with quiet dignity that made her height seem like strength rather than something to hide. She climbed the porch steps and settled beside him on the bench he had built during their 3rd month of marriage, both of them content to watch the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold as another successful day drew to a close. "Married for protection, stayed for partnership," Eleanor said softly, reaching over to take his hand in hers, her fingers no longer trembling but warm and steady, and Silas squeezed back gently, understanding that she was really saying something much deeper about how their desperate arrangement had transformed into genuine affection and respect, and about how 2 damaged people had found healing in building something together that neither could have managed alone.